Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director, and I'm so pleased to be moderating our first session, as well as welcoming you today to our Modern Hybrid Cloud Security Summit, brought to you by Delinea, Metallic, and A10 Networks. The editorial staff of RedmondMag.com, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWSinsider.net have worked really hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have a couple of announcements. First, this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing and listening. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next couple of days, so keep an eye out in your inbox for that link. Second, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as you think of them, and we'll get them answered for you by our experts. During today's third session, we'll be giving away a Dell Ultra Sharp 43-inch 4K USB-C monitor that you have to be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event to qualify for that drawing. And finally, we do have a bunch of resources from our sponsors, Delinea, Metallic, and A10 Networks, that are available on the console for you right now. So please download and check those out. It's because of Delinea, Metallic, and A10 Networks underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring today's event, supporting the community, and we ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. It's called Top Hybrid Cloud Security Threats. This session features audience favorite Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. He's also served with the Canadian Forces in the military intelligence branch. And after a year with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst and consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare organizations. Ian, take it away.
All right, and thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction. And I'm just going to add a few hobby-type things. It is true, very much what she said in terms of background. Currently, I'm the CISO at Cyjax. I run an MSP in Canada and a recording studio here in London. I am a member of the Beer Farmers. And I really am excited about this because this presentation is actually kind of an amalgamation of many that I've been doing over the last year with Redmond Channel partners and sponsors that have presented as webinars. So I'm really excited because this one is going to be jam-packed with a lot of observations from, I guess I would call it almost a year's worth of research into cloud, zero trust, and some of the sort of, I'm going to say, cutting and bleeding edge technology. And of course, a huge thank you to our sponsors, of which I couldn't pick a better group of sponsors for what I'm going to talk about today, and you can see why some of the observations that I have are going to really resonate with what they're bringing to the market right now. So I guess to start, hybrid, zero trust, all of these marketing words that we get, cloud, all of these things, there is a lot of confusion in the marketplace about what hybrid means. And then, what I found in terms of cybersecurity in general, but specifically to hybrid, is architecture is really one of the key things to get right when it comes to cloud. And this is where, working with the vendors, working with our sponsors, it becomes really, really important because if you don't get it right, it's going to be expensive to fix. And that's a universal sort of rule that we can apply based on some amazing data that IBM did back in the 90s, if you can believe it, where they essentially said it's 100x. What you may ask is 100x? Well, they charted the cost of fixing deficiencies from the beginning of the code that is sent up into an application or built in an application or the application itself. And it's 100 times more expensive to fix it in a production environment once it's released than it was to just get it right in the first place. And so that will really resonate with me throughout my cybersecurity career, but also exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And again, we don't really have a clue what architecture means. When you say architecture to non-IT people, they think buildings. Buildings have foundations. And if the foundation doesn't particularly work properly or can't carry the load, the rest of the project is in jeopardy. So I'm going to talk a lot about the fundamentals to get things right. I'm going to talk a little bit about the threat models that we face, but I'm going to talk really about the journey that you're going to be on when you start talking about these guys, the hybrids, from the movie The Expanse. Now, these were the deadliest creations in that particular universe. And it's fair to say that hybrid is something that we need to take a really good look at because we're being asked to do it a lot, right? So my working definition for this webinar is essentially that the hybrid cloud is a type of cloud computing combining on-premise infrastructure, private clouds, or public clouds, or even a hybrid cloud type of scenario that allow data and apps to move between the two environments, right? You think that's fairly simple. But when you think about data and apps, there's a lot more to it. And there's a number of layers involved in actually getting to that phase. Now, it's no secret that mixing public and private clouds or public and private infrastructure can sharply increase complexity and heighten the risk. Classic example is from some research that the firm that I work for here, Cygex, is looking at. We're looking at API security and APIs that have been publicly exposed because of a poor strategy for migrating into public clouds, where these APIs never required any protection because they existed within a controllable on-premise space. But as soon as they were put into the cloud, those APIs were publicly exposed. And unfortunately, some folks have taken, I would say, a poor approach to API security and have indeed, in some cases, embedded credentials and private keys within those APIs, which are then publicly available. So this is the attack surface that is emerging. It has been exploited by some threat actors, but certainly it is an area that has come out of not looking at the cloud as a different type of attack surface than on-premise, where you have all sorts of layers of defense that might be under your control. And ultimately, one of the things I always like to talk about when we get right down to it is that connectivity redundancy in the network layer is the vital ground. It's a complex beast that you're about to unleash when you're putting a front end or a back end into the cloud, but you're maintaining services and or APIs within your own data center, and you're exposing them. And exposing them in the wrong way can be catastrophic. And not only is it catastrophic, but it also can manifest itself in a physical threat that we'll get to shortly. But the data flows between the public and private clouds do create vulnerabilities that may lead to eavesdropping or cyber attacks. That's a given. Now, one of the issues is that a lot of the times what I've seen is infrastructure that's been migrated are using the same administrative accounts or the same service accounts on-premise and in the cloud without a security layer between them. That usually can lead to situations where if on-premise is not locked down and potentially compromised, that can give the keys to the infrastructure castle that you've built in the cloud. So identity and access management, and I will be speaking to this a little bit later, for cloud and hybrid environments is a no-fail task. Absolutely, it has to be done properly. Otherwise, you can be undone by the very simplest of cyber attacks, which is brute forcing accounts and in some cases, privileged accounts that aren't protected with multi-factor authentication, right? Also, in some cases, we have real-world compliance issues with meeting regulatory and data sovereignty requirements. Obviously, the EU-UK is one of the classic examples where there has to be a physical infrastructure and a corporate infrastructure that allows for sharing of data. If those things aren't there, it's now a moot point, and an organization could find that their dreams of processing European data using American infrastructure might be curtailed by regulatory issues and or data share or lack of data sharing agreements in place. Some organizations also push themselves out to deal with low latency issues by migrating various parts that might be compute intensive into a cloud environment. This is commonly done with a managed service provider where they can scale to meet demand and shrink when the situation calls for it. This, again, requires a lot of testing in order to work properly because you never want to pay for, and you pay for everything in the cloud, you never want to pay for things that you're not going to use, but at the same time, you want to make sure that that system is robust enough to withstand peak processing and peak data. And nothing is more devastating to your organization than not being able to allow for scale. For scale on the user side of the fence, but scale particularly on the customer side of the fence. And I do have a classic example of that. And, fundamentally, and this is where I think the managed services offerings become so important to an organization, is that ultimately a web application that's put into a hybrid environment is part not a technology problem. And what I mean by that is the architecture decisions are very much a human condition that is set up for success. The application itself and how it works in a safe manner with access control lists and security groups, not just one or not. It's important to get all of that right. It's super important to make sure that you have adequate visibility on the security control side, but it's super important to understand that if the architecture is poor and the application itself has vulnerabilities, and perhaps the vulnerabilities go further down in the chain, you now have a situation where you have a vulnerable app exposed to the world, and you don't even have the tooling to tell you just exactly how bad it is. Also, this is, I think, a huge issue that has to be tabled in terms of the hybrid relationship where you have your private cloud data center and you have connections, plural, I hope, properly load balanced with proper routing and proper round-robin DNS architecture in order to make sure that you can withstand a physical, accidental attack. Or in our new sort of paradigm where we have the impact of global climate change, which may affect your connectivity under conditions of storm, hurricane, floods, fires, those type of actual physical world problems, you're in a scenario where you need to have that level of redundancy and capability if you're in a hybrid model on both sides, your provider side. Now, to be fair, the big ones, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, have all of that necessary redundancy. But in the defense of redundancy, we have seen massive outages sweep across AWS, Azure, and Google at the same time. So what I'm saying is you have to have a plan in the hybrid world for redundancy on the provider side, but also your own personal redundancy for connectivity purposes within your own house of cards as well. Now, I want to talk about architecture. And this one is, I'm going to say, a bit controversial, because when we actually peer under the hood, And I got to thank a bunch of people that helped me out on this because, we broke it down into basically 3 sub-roles of an architecture, or as we want to call it, team architecture. We talk about an enterprise architect, right, focusing on making IT work for your organization with workflow, right? Possibly the author of and the guardian of the overall strategy to support the overall IT solution / strategy to support the organization's strategy moving forward. So that could be digital transformation as an initiative. The enterprise architect starts looking at what apps we have, which ones could become part of a cloud architecture or a hybrid architecture. Now, there's also a requirement for a software architect, especially if you're creating and building your own applications, because you need someone that can police the software development team and translate what the business wants into development speak to get things done. Now, there is a sort of a crossover between software architect and business analyst, or the new cool thing that's out there called BISO, which is a business information security officer, that to try and align the business with a development team and the business's overall goals when it comes to information and ICTC. So your actual connectivity piece as well as your digital transformation initiatives. And this is sort of a requirement, especially if you have your own development shop that is looking at moving from an on-premise environment to a cloud or a hybrid environment. There is a lot of work to be done here, and it is a skill set unto itself. And then finally, the infrastructure architect. Now, this is the person or within the organization that understands the current state of the infrastructure and the potential future state of the infrastructure and the interconnectivity requirements at the application and infrastructure layer, all right? So this is the person that can figure out what the scalability and what additional resources are required for storage, compute, and memory. Now, I have to put a caveat to this. This is a really expensive team, okay, that you're going to need to get the fundamentals right to enjoy the benefits of a hybrid environment or moving to a hybrid environment or even moving from on-premise all the way into clouds or various clouds, right? You might find that you have performance issues depending on what type of applications you're performing in some clouds. So there are situations I've seen where the front end to a website is in one cloud, and then the back end capabilities, reporting, monitoring, et cetera, and compliance are in a totally different cloud, and that data is pushed and pulled as required through API. All of that falls onto these, plus I would say $150K a year. Don't really care what a unit of compensation is, but these are experienced, probably 10 plus years in their fields with a track record and verifiable project success. So this is where the play comes from managed services when it comes to hybrid environments, because you need people that can be engaged at that level on these projects, which at the small, medium business level that might actually benefit very highly from a hybrid cloud environment, getting things to the point where they can move may not be worthy of a 300 plus per year or 300,000 plus per year salary. So there is a compelling argument here for consultation, consultants, and or outsourcing these various functions to roadmap this out. And again, this is not something that is decided overnight. This is a lot of study and careful analysis of the current state in order to reap the benefits of moving to the cloud. And keep in mind that things like CDNs, things like web application firewalls all have to be part of that discussion as well. So again, one of the things that we're seeing quite a bit in the industry is, of course, Azure, Amazon, and Google, containers specifically around Kubernetes, and as-a-service offerings. So database as a service, SQL as a service in Azure. And what is so funny is that the compliance people will come through and say, well, do you have antivirus on your database server? And you'll answer, it's impossible to have antivirus on our database server because our database server is not, in fact, a server in the traditional sense. It's a service, right? So there are a lot of issues and education required. I was speaking with a couple of experts in the fields that use different containers for different geos in order to meet regional compliance in countries that are heavily data regulated, like Saudi, Germany, and or China. This has now become the proposed sort of way or best practice of getting a grip and moving towards cloud-based hybrid architectures with the proper microsegmentation. And if those words aren't going to blow your mind or are blowing your mind, this is where you need a consulting partner in order to get you pointed in the right direction. And of course, you have other cloud providers, Rackspace being one of them, sort of called the Tier 2 Equinix, your DigitalOceans and OBS hosting as well. So you have a multitude of different types of cloud and types of infrastructure and types of platforms as a service to deal with as well, which all have various configuration and architecture challenges in their own right, not to mention different types of security appropriate to both risk and, of course, what your needs are from a compliance log retention and other factors as well. So this is not something that you enter into lightly. And, of course, I can't fix your on-premise data center. And this is where, if you're thinking of hybrid, if you're thinking of squeezing the last dollars out of your tin that you've implemented into your organization, you need to give some thought to whether or not your infrastructure that you have in your data center is really going to be adequate to realize those goals. Now, I know from a financial perspective, cloud can be really expensive. But cloud brokered through a managed service provider that is looking after different layers of this, it may not be as expensive as you think it is. However, having said that, it might actually be more expensive because you're going to have different tooling. You're going to have different security features added in order to get the visibility that you used to have in your on-premise data center in terms of like performance, app performance, but also anomaly detection, SIM, SOAR, you name it. You now have to look at a different set of technologies in order to realize that. So the on-the-ground reality is to really do a bit of a check and work with a vendor, work with a partner to see is this within the realm of or the art of the possible in terms of like how you're going to approach the hybrid cloud solutions for your organization. Now, this is where, again, and it's a good prelude to my original suggestions here, is that the worst enemy of security is complexity. Bruce Schneier, okay? He said that it is absolutely really important. Now, part of it is to caveat this is really around understanding the data flow, understanding the architecture, the fundamental ways that you're connected, and looking at the security required for the on-premise world that you're living in, but also that new cloud landscape that you might be moving to or considering moving to. So the more you end up doing this, the more research, the more diagrams you're going to need in order to really understand at the application and connectivity level what you're about to do and how you're about to do it in a safe manner, right? And I like to say, and this is sort of adopted from an old saying I had in the military, which is if the data is inside the organization and it should not be, that's a major problem. And if the data is outside the organization and it should not be, that's also a major problem. You've got to fix those problems, right? You cannot let APIs that contain credentials or keys be publicly exposed, because the bad guys will find them and they'll use them to your disadvantage, guaranteed. The other issue is don't start disabling security to make things work. This is probably one of the biggest threats to the organization, and it's a great prelude to my first problem, is that you don't know what you're doing, okay, when it comes to hybrid cloud. Also, part of this, especially on the application development side, is that if your security team has no programmers and your development team has no security people, you're in for a rough ride. They have to communicate when it comes to hybrid or pure cloud deployments. If they're not, that's a problem, and there has to be cross-pollination of skill sets. All right, asset problem. Huge problem in the industry, especially at enterprise that has grown and grown and grown. Asset management to business owner, again, can be really problematic. And in fact, through this process, you may even find orphaned and abandoned projects. Now, that's great, because as you go through and understand what things are actually talking to, it may raise the question of why do we have these things that aren't part of that process or workflow anymore? What are those things doing? So you might end up saving quite a bit of money as you find legacy infrastructure that perhaps no one has decommissioned properly, no one has turned it off, no one has removed a backup of it, and you might end up realizing quite a bit of money and actually attacking Bruce Schneier's principle and making things less complex to make it easier to secure. So one of the fundamental building blocks of architecture, and we've talked about all those fancy resources that we have, looking at that whole process of asset management, which will be a fundamental starting gate, if you will, for any migration to the hybrid cloud or cloud completely. Of course, encryption, both the solution and the problem, definitely. There are things that a hybrid cloud environment really does fix, such as server-to-server encryption, and in some cases encryption at rest or encrypted connections, TLS only. Those exist. However, I've seen horrific situations where, and folks, if you can believe this, right, in the modern day, right, you've got a load balancer terminating encryption, okay, and that's at the on-premise, mostly because load balancing and whatnot in the cloud can be expensive without, again, consulting excellent resources. But here's the deal. What the company had done is they had a load balancer on the on-premise side, cool, terminating encryption, and that's okay because it's still the resource, the database that they were going to was in the cloud, but the front-end boxes were on-premise, okay? So what did we have? We now had clear text being pushed across the internet to the database server that had been moved up into the cloud. This is not cool, and in fact breaks a whole bunch of cybersecurity best practices. Should you be able to compromise the API or the SOAP XML in this particular case, you basically had access to all of the data that was being collected by the web servers in clear text, because the connection was a clear text connection to the database in the cloud. Not cool. So not cool. And then, of course, we have compliance. Compliance worked really well with IT on-premise, right? Quite an easy function. Compliance in the cloud, like I said, with the guys going around with the checkboard, are you running antivirus? More difficult. because now you're going to be asked to show proof of how you're securing your cloud infrastructure, how you're monitoring it, that you may not even be familiar with if you don't have this training and the technology in place in order to do that, right? And of course, the big thing about going from on-premise into the cloud is your security tools that you've used, firewalls, networking, routing, all of those things are different in the cloud. They're all virtual. And it's a completely different skill set. It doesn't translate particularly well. It's sort of like the experience that a lot of organizations have had with Microsoft Exchange on-premise versus Exchange Office 365 in the cloud. Everything is different. And it's a completely different art form, a completely different science, if you will, to keep on-premise Exchange running than it is in the cloud, and especially Exchange running secure. I've still done audits and found POP, SMTP servers, unrestricted, open relay, even to this very day, if you can believe it. It baffles the mind, right? Now, I've talked about all the challenges or immense. I've talked about the requirements for leadership, but it's a bit story time. So this appeared in LREG, as we like to call it, basically saying Azure appears to be full. UK punters complain of capacity issues on Microsoft's cloud. How did this happen? Well, tell you a quick story. Beginning of the pandemic, the government announced that in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19, you should order your groceries online. It's a big thing here in the UK, right? But it wasn't a big thing of the 60 million plus people that live in this country. There was probably on average about 6,000 to 7,000 transactions per day. Well, imagine when the government announced this for the online grocery companies that we have here, including some big brands, all of a sudden they had to massively scale. And they ran out of disk, compute, and memory in the Azure cloud where some of these apps were. So again, this is where you have to think about scale. If suddenly, you make a huge product announcement, and it gets picked up by the media, et cetera, will your app allow you, both the back end and the front end, to be able to keep up with the level of traffic that you're going to be getting hammered with? And, here's a classic example of the government making an announcement and catching many grocery retailers by surprise. So on the point of you don't know what you're doing, what we find is these questions. If these questions are all sort of like relevant to your organization and asking the relevant people, and the answers aren't really straightforward, you might be in trouble, right? If you're asking questions about what do you mean it doesn't work in production, it worked fine on my machine, I'm going to tell you that your software development lifecycle may not be up to speed, including if someone asks you what the SDLC is, that could be an indicator you've got a problem. And the lack of Q&A testing and security is a major problem. We've seen situations where a push to production resulted in a massive issue, mostly because production at scale, running the number of transactions, has you're one memory leak away from having production fall down because at that scale, it didn't have enough memory. It consumed all the memory. In a test environment that isn't scaled to your production environment, you may never find that bug in that code. So, a huge shout out to Sean Wright Sec and AppSec Bloke if you want to follow them on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @fat_hobbit. But, supply chains. This is a huge issue. We've seen it with some of the current vulnerabilities that we're dealing with, Log4j being a good one. You'll see issues with Lodash Modernizer, et cetera. Again, library management, or what the cool kids are calling SBOM now, software bill of materials, has become an issue, not only for making sure that you know what you're actually, how that application works at a library level, but in vulnerability management, where you can get a quick answer to, do we use this library that now has this issue and can compromise the application. This is a controversial one. I'll go right out and say it. In some cases, moving a poorly written application, especially if you hear the words rolled our own crypto, into the cloud can be a terrible idea, especially if there's not compensating controls in front of it. Because not only can you have a business logic error, but you can have a poor code written in such a way, and one of the classics is when you're dealing with an older web application that has a front-end, back-end relationship to a database. One of the biggest no-nos in modern software development is instead of using parameterized inputs on the front end of the web, you're putting filters in front of the input. And eventually what happens there is the application can be compromised by you missing a particular filter for a type of attack. Better to have used parameterized inputs in the first place, and better to use a more modern language, such as C++ and PHP, such as Spring, Ruby on Rails, Django, Node.js, and .NET, depending on what type of shop you are, because it's more constrained. And so you do have a balance within your development team of, can I have the flexibility in the language that I'm building my application in order to accomplish what I need to accomplish, or do I balance that with a more restrictive language that prevents some very common OS 10 attack surfaces, right? And then again, misconfiguration, please see number one, you don't know what you're doing. And that's not, I'm not being mean here. Literally, the art of getting something from one place to another in IT, we all know can be a big challenge for an organization. And a lot of times, organizations, the IT department, the project management team, the consultants are incentivized to deliver as opposed to incentivized to safely deliver. So again, it may not be that you don't know what you're doing, you just don't have time to actually figure out how to do it correctly. So again, who's the owner of this? This is a question that is a difficult one for some organizations, but IT seems to, in my experience, seems to want to suggest that they don't own the data, right? That the data is the business's. But the business frequently, unless there's a layer, that architecture layer I talked about, that BISO layer, a business analyst that has one foot in the IT world, they are clueless about that data. And in a lot of cases, they have a workflow that they do, but they don't really even know all the technical pieces of that workflow because it's looked at as an IT thing. So there's a delta that you have to engage in a conversation with the business for a clear demarcation between what is sort of in the scope of IT and what is outside the scope of IT, especially when you're dealing with third-party applications in SaaS. Modern egress and ingress traffic is highly complex in a hybrid environment. Absolutely. I've seen horrible things like SMB V1 protocol being used to authenticate over the public internet. That's a terrible idea, unless you have some compensating controls or a point-to-point VPN connection or an IPsec tunnel to run it through. Because if you're exposing that to the public internet, that's how you want WannaCry, that's how you get WannaCry. You want NotPetya, that's how you get NotPetya. I could go on with the LDAP attack that leveraged Log4j, but again, if you're passing LDAP traffic across the internet and you're open to the internet, you can expect that type of attack to victimize your organization quite quickly if you have that vulnerability. Architectural review has to be there. Somebody else has to take a look at it before it gets built. Because once it's built, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to fix, especially if it accidentally goes into production. And again, devs got to engage and understand what the use cases is and the business case and justification for the effort. If the business hasn't signed off on it, you better be really cautious about presenting them a new fancy thing that they haven't had any input into. And I have seen that happen as well. And it can be no fun at all. Again, so the question now comes in, but will what we have done work safely? You need to look at threat modeling, secure coding practices, dev team continuously trained on security, automated testing. This has now become a big issue ever since the various codes that have gone into production or have accidentally been put on a public repository where they have a massive vulnerability or embedded credentials or all sorts of sins, including certificates and private keys. Acceptance tests on QA and pen tests on the QA environment. Now, this is a bit of a controversial statement because I'm against testing in prod, pen testing prod. I believe that QA should be working on the dev or staging environment, which would be equally secured and scaled at scale to the production environment. So, if you've got 10 database servers, you might get away with using, 2 database servers, and 2 web servers as opposed to a cluster of 10 or 15 web servers. So what I'm asking you to do here is actually make this the QA and pen testing environment non-production, because if there is a problem in production that's discovered during a pen test, that problem could manifest as a self-inflicted outage. Okay, I've seen that as well. Remediation of vulnerabilities is a critical task. Obviously, it's different in the on-premise world than it is in the cloud world. There's a requirement for snapshots of VMs. There's the ability to roll back to previous states that need to be part of your vulnerability management. Case of example where if you had Active Directory servers on-premise that were involved in application delivery to customers, and you potentially applied some of the latest and greatest Microsoft patches, you could break trust between workstations and users, and that always ends up in tears, right? And rinse and repeat. These processes should be repeatable. It should be a template. In the best cases, you've automated all of that with various tools. Now, encryption, again, I said, is that double-edged sword. I gave you the example of terminating encryption at the load balancers instead of having it all the way across. The cloud takes care of a lot of those problems because one Amazon machine talking to another Amazon machine within the same tenant, the connections are encrypted by default. So again, you're benefiting from having a bunch of stuff in the cloud. But that doesn't mean on your on-premise connections that, again, please avoid clear text and clear text protocols, because that again is terrible. Also, again, making sure that on your front end side, you're up to date on your versions of TLS. Otherwise, you're going to get, a constant parade of bug bounty hunters saying, oh, I found a cipher suite and you're missing X headers on your web application. Can I have bug bounty? It's actually a signal to noise ratio problem that you're going to be faced with if you don't have everything righty-tighty, especially given there's free tools out there that you can check what the cipher suites that you're reporting at, like SSL Labs, for instance. And then again, production pen testing, I don't recommend it at all. And again, that QA and staging environment should be a microcosm with all the same types of security that you have in front of it, with the absence of production data, if I haven't gotten to that slide there. Right, the C word, okay? The compliance word. That's the one I was looking for, okay? Again, you need to talk about lag aggregation and SIM across public, private, and edge. It can be very expensive. I have seen what happened to organizations that decide to take the SIM tool and turn it into a compliance tool. SIMs are finely tuned security appliances and not designed for logging at scale massive amounts of data. I've seen a bank throw 13 terabytes of data at a SIEM, and the SIEM just fell over and died, right? Because it became the logging solution. This happens because in a lot of cases, SIEM pricing isn't based on, or is based and fixed on the amount of processing as opposed to, or per application or per seat, as opposed to something like Splunk, which the more money, it just creates a situation where if you're not managing the data within Splunk and purging out that data, it becomes an incredibly expensive endeavor. So again, professionals that work in this space that offer managed solutions are the ones that you need to talk to about how you're going to manage that compliance issue, how you're going to manage that security issue, and to keep it away from the business at large that is going to come to you with compliance needs. And again, I love to say that security is not compliance, but proof of the existence of security is compliance, right? So again, don't get confused. I believe the more robust your security is, the easier it'll be to be compliant, as opposed to if your security is just compliant, that means sadly you're probably going to get owned. No doubt about it. Now, for some buzzwords, okay? Beware of executives armed with zero trust. We've been talking about the hybrid cloud, and at some point in the conversation, there will have to be a discussion. Now, the discussion for you folks out there around zero trust is simply this. At some point in the entire supply chain, there has to be some level of trust, okay? Because zero trust is not absolute. I mean, if you're working in Amazon, if you're working with third-party SaaS, if you're using an infrastructure provided by a third party, there has to be a level of trust in all of that, right? This chart is the number one way of working with an executive team or a digital transformation team on a zero trust initiative, combining hybrid and cloud, which is identity management. Let's get our IDAM down to 100% before we touch any of these other things. Because if IDAM isn't 100%, identity and access management, chances are the whole rest of your zero trust initiative will fail spectacularly. So you need to create a single source of truth and automate identity and access management and RBAC as your first part of the initiative. Now, that should breathe you a sigh of relief, because as you're talking about migrating applications to the cloud and or in a hybrid environment, you can have IDAM discussion in the organization that will support the zero trust initiative but not interfere with your application move plans. The most important thing of that identity and access management is the credentials to the keys to the castle. So whether that's domain admin, root, whatever you want to call it, if you're not 100% sure who's using what credentials within your organization, you have a problem at the very beginning of the ideas of implementing zero trust in your chain. So I get this a lot. A lot of people come to me and say, Ian, so, you talked a lot about stuff. You've been shouting at me for damn near 50 minutes now. What do we need to do? Well, it's actually both a psychological and process and technology all combined into one. So people, process, technology. We're back to that, okay? Certainly, when you talk about hybrid environments, when you talk about on-premise and now cloud, you need to start developing that DevOps, that DevSecOps mindset 100%, okay? That has to be part of the equation. Now, I like to graph CTI onto that because those should be the people, cyber threat intelligence should be providing you with your threat models, with some of that asset information, with what could attackers do to our organization, right? So the first thing is, of course, to look at secure software development lifecycle needs to be part of the organization's DNA. If you don't know what that is, Google it. That's a great way to start on putting non-vulnerable applications in the code and developing a whole methodology of dealing with the attack surface, right? Next thing, start training your developers on putting secure code. It's the lowest cost option, as I quoted on that IBM, right? On that IBM study. Way lower to not have to fix things in production than trying to fix things in production. Again, web application vulnerability scanner, not the only answer to application security. There's a lot of OS 10 which are around more best practices than there are somehow that you can scan for, poorly done architecture, right? So that's a huge factor as well. And then application development in any environment should be a team effort, aligned and managed to organization's objectives, 100%. If you're working on things that don't have the business support, that's not good. That means you're living in a silo and things can look particularly not great. And then finally, tech tactics, training, and procedures, T3P, as I like to call it, right? We used to do TTPs. I'm doing T3Ps. CDNs and WAFs are part of your strategy. And again, this might be appropriate on both sides of your fence, of your on-premise and in your cloud. CDN can make a huge difference in your costs with regards to data transfer, especially from the cloud. So you'll want to look very carefully at that. SIEM and load balancers, also really huge part of that solution suite, if you will. Multi-factor authentication, access controls for environments, repos, signing key management. I'd even suggest SSO for third-party applications to really lock down that IDAM, that identity and access management around zero trust. Integrity monitoring, vulnerability scanning, all part of the equation. Can be expensive, especially if it's not bundled under people that know what they're doing, because again, when you start getting into this particular piece, it can be overwhelming, and you don't know what to work on first. I love to say that secure the development environment as you would production, right? You've got to have your security in place to make sure that your whole development supply chain is not compromised like some high-profile attacks that we don't necessarily need to go into, but you all know who I'm talking about. Remove the production data in your development environment. Again, sanitizing that data, not only is it a best practice, but it can massively reduce the attack surface of your organization if your development environment isn't nearly as secure as, for instance, your production environment. I've seen development environments that are essentially a remote desktop to a cloud environment, not protected by multi-factor authentication, and that remote desktop wasn't patched. So there you go, right? Bad news. No compensating controls, no way of restricting access to that particular development environment. Now, some people do this because they're working with third-party development firms, many of them overseas. That's no excuse. There's plenty of technologies to do that securely, to provide that access securely. DR and BCP testing has to be part of the equation. I cringe every time I hear that, if there's a problem in production, we'll just push the last build that we did from our development environment to production and we're back in business. No. Because if production has been compromised, there's a good chance the bad guys know about where those connections are coming from, and if you've had poor hygiene, don't have the other security controls in place, there's a good chance that your dev environment is compromised as well. And this is what the bad guys will do to maintain persistence within your organization. You have to have DR and BCP, and it has to be tested. Have you ever tested from a push from dev into your production environment? Many organizations have tested that and test it on a regular basis, but then the problem is they may not have iterative or copies of their dev environment from a while back to be able to examine if there has been code inserted and or other sorts of compromises that have taken place. So that becomes critical. And finally, on my list of things, before we turn it over to some Q&A, is make sure you're using all the tools available like IPsec, VPN, and MPLS to secure those on-premise to cloud infrastructure. And with that, we are back to our lovely hosts to ask me the tough questions.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Ian. We do have a couple of minutes for some questions, so let's get started. It would be nice, this is from the audience, obviously. It would be nice to convert old code to new language, but doesn't that increase the cost substantially in terms of training, new staff, et cetera?
Can you repeat the question for me? I just cut out briefly.
Of course. So the audience member asks, it would be nice to convert old code to new language, but doesn't that increase the cost substantially in terms of training and new staff, et cetera?
Potentially, but what I'm talking about now is really around looking at your application architecture, and rather than sort of like pushing patch after patch and update after update, it's really now about building services within the cloud, within that environment. And if you can start migrating stuff to more of a service architecture using APIs for certain functions, especially when you start reusing code across your entire base, it's not nearly as expensive as you think it might be. And because it's sort of like one of those snowballs on a hill that it'll start rolling, and all of a sudden, you're now migrating what is potentially a large attack surface of legacy stuff into something that is more efficient and more portable across different platforms as well. So I think there's a huge benefit to it. Now, the best thing to do is to set up a bit of your own study group and do a cost-benefit analysis of it, because, depending on how whether it's customer-facing or internal, is going to be a big part of that discussion. And that's something I'd land on the shoulders of the architects.
Perfect. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for Q&As, but Ian, thanks for that great presentation. We have a bunch of audience questions for you, though, which we'll get to you, and then hopefully you can reach out to them after the fact and see if you can resolve some questions for them. But that was a great presentation as always. Thanks for that, Ian. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back at the top of the hour for the second session, Top Security Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Infrastructures. In the meantime, take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Delinea, Metallic, and A10 Networks, and we'll be right back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being here. And special thanks to our sponsors, Delinea, Metallic, and A10 Networks for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of the summit called Top Security Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Infrastructures. Our speakers for this session are the dynamic duo of Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John has worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author during his more than 20 years in IT. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He has authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspiratory books and exec blueprints, and develops courseware for Pluralsight. John often speaks at IT events such as Tech Mentor, Cloud and Virtualization Live 360, and others. He's also a multi-year Microsoft MVP and has received NEOSA's CIO of the Year award. Dave and John, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the team for having us. A little bit of housekeeping for everyone before we get into our session here. John and I love to make these sessions dynamic, so if you have any questions at all, we're going to try to get to as many as we can live during the session. We'll pop out as we work our way through some of the content. But it's such a pleasure to be back. And John, I took a couple of months off, had a chance to go to Hawaii and recharge, and this is our first event back in a little while, so it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. I so enjoy these chances we get together and interact with our IT community, and thanks to 1105 and Redmond Mag and everything everyone does to make these possible. And thanks, David, for the great introduction.
All right, John, let's get going. So in this session that we're talking about here today, we're talking about security best practices for hybrid cloud environments. And so one of the things that I really wanted to focus on is, I think personally, John, I think the game has really changed in 2021 and 2022, because the threat landscape that's out there and the bad guys that are targeting our infrastructure, it doesn't seem to be getting any better. Both of us work in environments where we're responsible for security infrastructure for both production, dev test, and our secured fabric workloads. And so, looking at better ways to improve our security posture is just something that I really believe that everyone has to put as a top priority item heading through 2022. And John, what are some of those areas that you see as kind of top starting points for organizations to look at?
Well, so one thing that I really like to mention to everyone in the 2022 landscape is, of course, the shift that we've seen in cybersecurity from a stance of where it really was cyber attacks based on criminal activity trying to gain monetary or espionage type thing, to cyber warfare, which is the result of some of the developments with Russia attacking Ukraine and the cyber threats that have come out of there. And so that has changed what we do, and it also changes how we leverage both on-prem resources and cloud resources. So it changes a bit of what the hybrid cloud looks like in organizations. And, for the first time in 2022, we're seeing threats targeted directly at sectors such as manufacturing, transportation, and those industries may not have in the past focused so much on how those threats impact their decision making when it comes to migrating legacy apps into the cloud or keeping them on-prem and how they're going to protect them. And they're having to make a rapid adjustment. And unfortunately, when you have to make rapid adjustments, sometimes things get missed or that kind of thing. So I like to kind of bring up that people really need to focus on how their hybrid plans are changing, how their actual state of the union of their hybrid is right now, and to point out a single item on this list, that ability to manage, right? The single pane of glass, the ability to see your landscape and what's happening and quickly ascertain data points that you might need to know about or take action on, right? And so however you accomplish that, it's more critical than ever, because you need to be able to measure what you have going on if you're going to be able to manage what you have going on.
No, absolutely. And remember that in part of securing your infrastructure, the often forgotten item for, most IT admins is your core network infrastructure, your switches, your firewalls, your IoT devices that are sitting out there, your robotic infrastructure if you're in manufacturing. All of that needs to be secured as well. And so one of the things that, we're really finding, I know yourself and myself, John, is the fact that, for years we've had partnerships with organizations that help, especially in the manufacturing sector, to manage and maintain some of those areas inside the plant floor. And so sometimes they need access to get in, and they need to manage infrastructure. And that's one of the areas that we have found with a lot of organizations that security is really lacking, because there could have been an open-ended internet connection allowing that organization in. It could have been open-ended VPN with no multi-factor authentication, And so that piece, I think everyone really needs to pay attention to inside of your infrastructure, because almost everyone has some type of network infrastructure that's forgotten about. And, it was often the HVAC system. It was often the camera systems that never got updated. Don't forget about that infrastructure. If that lives on your network, you need to segment, you need to isolate, and you need to protect that in the same way that you do your production workloads.
And Dave, I just want to jump in because you said something that so resonates. And that's talking about those external stakeholders, whether they be vendors or customers or even remote workers. Everybody that we talk to, I know you emphasize this as much as I do, they need to understand that any person they allow to get in or any system they allow to connect to their network, their security is only as strong as that security. So when you take a vendor and you let them connect in through that VPN into your network, you're basically saying, without any knowledge of how they're configured, you're saying that vendor has security that's at least as good as what you have. And in reality, what we find a lot, Dave, is, and this, is that those vendors are running their workstations with local admin privileges, and they have very little security or whatever. So you can have the best perimeter security going on, and you allow this connection to occur because, quote unquote, it's necessary, and all of a sudden you've got weeks of downtime because they happen to have malware on their machine and they just unleashed it inside your network, walked it right by your firewall, walked it right by your IPS systems, and connected right inside the network. So take that zero trust methodology and mentality serious, and understand that when you connect those vendors in, they are part of your hybrid infrastructure then. So it may not be existing in a public cloud, but in a sense, that network now becomes part of your private cloud. So all your connections, you need to understand them, know where they're coming from, and make decisions on them, active decisions. Don't be surprised by anything. That always gets me so down when I find out that somebody is affected and taken offline, and people's jobs are impacted, and the root cause is, well, we just didn't realize that external vendor or that external partner, wasn't taking adequate protections. You can't just assume that they're going to protect themselves like you do.
No, absolutely, John. How I equate that to today is those open-ended VPNs with partners connecting in is almost like going into your parking lot, finding a USB stick that's sitting in your parking lot and saying, "Hey, let's plug this in on our network and let's see what's on this thing. This looks interesting." It's kind of the same concept, right? And so along those lines, sorry, John. Along those lines, there's a few things that we can do to protect our environments, because there's just certain unknowns inside of your infrastructure that, we're doing the best job that we can as IT professionals and security professionals. But you and I both know this, John, that, it's a marathon, not a sprint, in order to get to your security posture that you need to be at in 2022. And so, you've got to make sure that you keep pressing forward. But one of the things that everyone can do today to protect yourselves, if you're not already doing this, your hypervisors that drive that hybrid cloud infrastructure should not be joined to your production domain. We've kind of created a scenario, John, over the years where, we started off with early versions of enterprise networking with NDS inside of Novell, and then we moved over to early versions of Active Directory and eDirectory with Novell. And what happened with that was very segmented infrastructure. We had domains all over the place. And so for 20 years, we told everyone, listen, you need to consolidate your infrastructure. It's too hard to manage everything. Well, inadvertently, what we did is we actually took what I'll call very secure model to a more insecure model where we consolidated everything down to single domains is utopia. It took 20 years to get there, and now we're there, and we realize that, oh, maybe that actually wasn't such a good idea, because if somebody gains admin context inside of, a single domain flat security infrastructure, that means that they now have your hypervisors. If you've got radius authentication with admin accounts into your switches, and you're using those same accounts in that same domain, now they've potentially got the bad guys as well. So one of the things that we can quickly do, John, is we can build what's called a fabric. And simply put, the fabric is a separate Active Directory domain enforced. We harden it with the best practice policies because we're not dealing with the sins of the past that we've had from the existing Active Directory infrastructure. We make sure that we use privileged access workstations and isolate who can access what from where and when, enable conditional access and multi-factor authentication on everything inside of there, and use the latest next generation real-time threat protection and run vulnerability assessments real time. And not just in the fabric. Some of these security pieces are also very important for your on-prem infrastructure. But at the end of the day, John and I have been part of ransomware recovery teams. And part of that ransomware recovery effort is taking and having to rebuild everything from scratch. And it's a lot easier to rebuild everything from scratch when we segment everything off in this guarded fabric. So John, any comments on the fabric? And do you see any reasons why any organization should not do this?
So, Dave, absolutely. I don't see any reason why an organization shouldn't do this. In fact, I recommend them to do it without delay, because identity management has become one of the weak points that attackers are exploiting. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, in 2022, we have shifted from a cyber attack landscape to a cyber warfare landscape. And there's a distinct difference between those two. In a cyber warfare landscape, there is malware and there are attacks out there that aren't designed to preserve anything. They're just designed to disrupt and destroy as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And in that case, having this separate identity management infrastructure, this independent secured fabric that has very limited access and very little published details and that kind of thing, creates an underlying mechanism for you to get in and bring up new defenses when your old defenses have possibly failed, right? So it gives you your own, not backdoor, but secure footing from which to mount a defense if these type of attacks come. And, Dave, you and I have seen it where identity management, Active Directory is compromised, and a DC, the sysvol gets encrypted or something like that, and it's game on, and that's hard to get in front of an attacker that's doing that. But with the secure fabric, we have options available. So do that as quickly as possible. And the MFA thing, I'm just going to take a minute and mention that we have seen a significant trend in insurance carriers and financial controls auditors to require MFA. My expectation is that in 2023, if you're going to renew a cyber insurance policy and you want any kind of significant coverage, they're going to want MFA on everything. So if you're using software role accounts to run monitoring utilities or software, you better start trying to come up with a plan like group managed service accounts or removing the log on locally right, or being able to prove that these accounts aren't standardized accounts that require MFA, because otherwise, when you need that cyber insurance policy, it's not going to be there. And another point on that, we're actually seeing that this is so important that accreditation agencies are starting to add in cybersecurity points to their audit. So if you want to be ISO certified or A2LA certified, if you're a laboratory, or TS, any of those certification organizations, they're starting to add in cybersecurity questions. So areas where IT really wasn't involved before, the quality department typically took care of these things, or the laboratory or whatever. Now we have to play in that sandbox, and if we can't provide that information, our organization loses out on those accreditations. So be prepped for that.
Yeah, awesome, John. Awesome. And hey, Thomas had a really good question here. And his question is, I'm against allowing vendors 24/7 access. I believe that before a vendor accesses your resources, there should be a change control record logged for audit and accountability, and thoughts. And so I'll take the
I want to jump in here, Dave.
Oh, I know. So my only point to this is, Thomas, is that what I believe is you're 100% correct. Audit that, make sure that you've got everything tracked. You should also look at privileged identity management as well, where you can take low privileged accounts and you can grant access for a specific period of time. When they no longer require access, remove that access. And so, John, I'll let you finish up the answer on that.
And so, Thomas, you're absolutely correct. And in fact, I take it a step further. And when I work with organizations, what I tell them is that they should adopt a policy where no vendor can contact without their knowledge. Let's look at this from a practical standpoint. A vendor wants in to do some programming in a PLC, a program logic controller that's running a machine out on your plant floor or whatnot. The vendor wants to be able to do that kind of at their convenience or at their call or whatever. Well, that poses many dangers for the customer, me, not the least of which is cybersecurity concerns. But there's also concerns that they could create unattended consequences, meaning unattended downtime of the machine, or worse yet, this is a physical machine. Say it moves when I don't expect it to move, it could hurt someone. So the policy that I recommend be put in place, and that I often put in place, is the way this works is the vendor wants to get in, they have to contact us, and me, the customer, I have to initiate the remote session. So I have to do something to turn on their ability to gain access, enable their account so that the VPN works, whatever, but I have to turn it on. And I actually have an internal process that says one of my employees has to be present and aware of the connection when it starts, when it ends, if it's going into a machine, that machine is properly locked out, tagged out, that kind of thing. But I'm controlling that interaction of the vendor with my systems. And of course, I'm also using automated systems to monitor and maintain access, authorization, and accountability. And I'm creating documented records of when they're in there. All that stuff is important, and it should be controlled. And you, the customer, should absolutely do things to be aware and in control of those environments. And one last quick thing that I will mention is that Dave, you and I also developed a system that I like to call the rapidly deployable secure network. And so we use other technologies to provide connectivity to the internet, so whether that be cellular or satellite, whatever. But we have a completely deployable network design that allows us to deploy that to a given workstation or set of workstations, have a vendor come in, but it is actually air-gapped from the live network. So if a threat comes in, it is contained with that. And we can deploy that solution. It's designed and documented. We can deploy it anywhere we need to. That's within our reach. So we can ship it somewhere, or we can drive somewhere and deploy it, or fly somewhere and deploy it. But once we're on site, we can deploy it within minutes. And that's another means to mitigate the risk of unattended access.
Yeah, those open-ended VPNs, once again, they're like your USB sticks in the parking lot, John. All right, on the topic of staying secure, so now you've got your fabric built. Congratulations, you're taking your first step to securing your hybrid hybrid infrastructure, now you've got to make sure that you stay secure, John. And so there's been some big changes that have occurred in late 2021 and 2022 that we've seen coming through with cyber insurance policies. And they're in regards to the CVEs, the critical vulnerabilities and exploits that come out inside of your infrastructure. And so we'll talk about that in just a second, because that's a really big one. And that's kind of a little get out of jail free cards, as I see it, for the cyber insurance vendors. Because remember, the insurance industry is a for-profit industry. And so they're not going to just hand out payments without some type of criteria. And so they want to make it hard on you to get paid out. And that's just been the insurance game forever. And so nothing has changed. But with all of the ransomware attacks that have occurred through, the most terrible global pandemic in history with COVID-19, we've seen such an uptick in cyber threats come through the landscape that, the amount of customers getting hit with ransomware attacks and stuff, they've had to pay out a lot. And so I'll come back to you on that very specific point in just a second here, John. But when you take and you're dealing with security and any of your hybrid infrastructure, a good friend of mine, Sami Lihov, has always said, and he's this just resonates so much with me, John. He's like, don't let good be the enemy, or don't let perfection be the enemy of good. So you always want to keep moving that needle forward. You can't wait until you have a perfect design, because the perfect design actually doesn't exist out there today. There's always going to be something that's going to need to be changed inside of a design, especially when we look at cybersecurity. So when you're you build that fabric, don't wait 6 months to start moving your key resources and hypervisors into that fabric to secure them, because that could be what saves you at the end of the day. All right? And the next question that I've had coming through 2022, John, is that should we have more than one fabric? And so the concept here is that, okay, well, we have our hypervisors running in one fabric, and that's great, but what if that's compromised as well? Should we maybe have our backup and DR administrators with their backup critical infrastructure living in a separate fabric? And my answer to that is, yeah, obviously more fabrics is going to be more secure, but it's a management piece here as well. So if you can manage it and you want to secure like that, the harder that you make it for the bad guys to get in, the better that it is for your infrastructure. Okay. And the next one here is one that I'll touch, and I'll hand it over to you after this, John, is that please, everyone, if you have older operating systems out there and you're living in a world where, oh, we can't upgrade that because we don't really know how the application was installed, and that's the reason that we still have 2008 R2 or 2012 R2 Windows servers living on the network. I can't be blunt enough when I say this, John. Those are harder to secure than newer modern operating systems. Newer modern operating systems have protection built right into the kernel of the operating system. It's not a layer that you're adding on top. A lot of it's built right in. And so if you're leaving that old stuff out there, you're at very high risk in your hybrid infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, or wherever you run that. So, John, can you talk a little bit, because I know that you're the expert on cyber insurance and, these CVEs. I heard that in some of the policies that you've actually seen a sliding scale now for CVEs written into some of the cyber insurance policies.
Absolutely, Dave. And so, I have to emphasize what you said, and Sammy and I have discussed Voltaire's aphorism, perfect is the enemy of good, many times. And, I tell people when I talk about that, it was as valid 300 years ago as it is when he said it, as it is today. We can get so tied up in wanting to be perfect that we absolutely leave a bunch of holes that create our own demise. And, that a lot of that comes to some of the insurance and the security issues that are out there. Everybody thinks they have to be perfect to get coverage. And so they answer questions wrong or inconsistently or that kind of thing. And I found that, unfortunately, that's a really bad approach. If you don't meet something, what I found is most effective is go into it with complete transparency with the insurance broker that you're working with or the auditor or whatever it is, and say, hey, we don't meet this, but then come to them with a plan on how you're going to meet it and when you're going to be able to meet it and that kind of thing. Usually, in my experience, they will work with you. You might get a policy at a lower limit than you expected. Your premium might be higher, but you'll still get the policy. And that's better than the outcome. And I know a lot of IT people don't believe this, but this is the reality. I've seen it a dozen times this year already. And that is the reality that you have cyber insurance. You've been paying your premium. You have an event. You lose millions of dollars because the way this works out is you have to pay that money out. The insurance company doesn't provide it like a checkbook as you go along. You have to pay it out and then get them to reimburse you. And on the reimbursement, they send in, you can think of it as an adjuster, but it's a forensic specialist that then takes all the assertions that you, the IT team, made during your application, such as, do you have MFA on all remote connectivity accounts? And they come in and they find that that vendor account, that vendor VPN account that you've mentioned a few times, Dave, and they say, hey, wait a minute, this one doesn't have. And you as the IT pro think that there's an opportunity here for you to justify that or explain that. And I haven't seen that in one single instance be the case, where you could provide an explanation for why you said, yes, all accounts have it, but you didn't actually apply it to all accounts. In those cases, the insurance company denies the claim and your company doesn't get reimbursed. And I have actually seen it, personal experience, where someone had coverage and lost a $4 million claim based on that. And I don't want to be the IT guy that answers the question that says, hey, we have MFA on all accounts, and then we need to get $4 million reimbursement, and I have to look at my company and go, yeah, well, I answered that yes, but it really wasn't true, and they denied our claim. That probably wouldn't work out too well for me. So I just recommend to people, don't do that. Be transparent, be open. It is what it is. The landscape is what it is. But be prepared to plan out changes. And as part of that, the insurance companies are getting tighter and tighter on these CVE and patch deployments, right? And so the U.S. government, a lot of theirs, like when it comes to Windows updates or patches, they require that you have those things deployed to systems within 3 weeks. And insurance companies, what I'm noticing, are following suit. So a lot of them have requirements that say, hey, patches have to be required or have to be implemented within X amount of time frame from their release by a vendor. And you can't justify why you don't do it. If you don't do it, that's fine with them. They just won't cover you. They won't offer you a policy. And what we're finding is that they will have started implementing a sliding scale where they say, okay, well, if you implement it within 14 days, you're fine. If you implement it somewhere between 14 and 30 days and have an event, we're only going to cover 80% of your policy limit. If after you implement it after 30 days but before 90 days, we're going to cover you at 50%, and so on and so forth. I have actually seen some insurance underwriters specify that if you don't have a patch installed on all identified systems, so any system that the manufacturer releasing the patch says this patch should go to, I've seen policies where if you don't have that done within the 90-day period, your coverage drops to zero. So I expect that to continue and to increase in tightness over the coming years because, Dave, you said it first thing on this slide. Insurance companies are for profit, and they are losing a lot of money on cyber insurance right now. So they're trying to tighten up those losses and make it harder for them to lose money when they pay out on these claims.
All right, John, fantastic. So we have a couple questions that have come in here. One is a really great one from Michael. And the question is, and I'll take this one, John. If Windows 2012 R2 is more vulnerable, which version of Linux is more vulnerable? And I think there's a bigger question to this, Michael, than just which versions. I think what you need to be looking at here is you need real-time vulnerability assessment tools inside of your infrastructure that can take and help you answer those questions. Because it's not specifically it's 2012 R2, because next week it could be 2016, or next week it could be 2019, or it could be this distribution of Linux. Anything you put on your network, you need to make sure that you've got tools to help you with real-time vulnerability assessments. And then the second question came in from Breeza. It's how do you deal with legacy networks when you're migrating to hybrid cloud infrastructure? And for that one, that's also a very good question. Don't be scared to change your network infrastructure design. What was architected 20 years ago might have worked 20 years ago. If you have to reinvent some things to work inside of the new infrastructure, don't be scared to do that. If you've got to create new subnets, if you've got to create new VLANs, if you've got to take and move to a newer technology like VXLANs, and Kevin had a question like that with network virtualization. If you want to move to something like network virtualization, all of those are good ideas. They just require a little bit more operational guidance from your team, and they're going to require some precision to get them implemented. And once again, anything you can make it tougher on the bad guys to get into your infrastructure and secure things, the better off that you are. Okay, this next one, John, and we're taking our time going through these. We still do have a lot of content, so we'll cover the next couple here quickly. Okay. This one here is so important because we just went through this with a couple customers, and I've spoken to some of my friends around the world. Your core infrastructure that drives that hybrid cloud is run by physical servers. Those physical servers have out-of-band access points to get into them, depending on what version of server. It could be IPMI, ILO, IDRAC, whatever that is. Please change those passwords. Please make sure that you even go the next step and you take and you set different passwords across those. Also, please make sure that you run those on isolated networks so that they're not available and just scannable across the flat network. All right, that's so important. And the same goes for your building access systems, anything like that. Those could be easy, low-hanging fruit for the bad guys where they'll just hang out. And in a lot of cases, when they get access to one of those systems, John, correct me if I'm wrong, because you and I have seen this, they'll hang out on one of those systems, like, for example, a building access system that had weak security, that was vendor managed, and then what they'll do is they'll take and they'll load their command and control software on there, they'll scout your network, they'll figure out everything that's inside, and they'll just sit dormantly and wait to come back when they know after they've researched your infrastructure. So the big thing here is your physical security on any of your switches, your out-of-band infrastructure. Make sure that you secure that as well. It's not just all about the operating system. Anything to add to this, John?
Dave, I could talk about this for hours, but like you said, we got a lot of great content to give. So I think you covered it well, and let's just keep moving forward. All right, great.
I'll let you take this one here, John, for hybrid access. What are some of the key points for hybrid access? Because now we've built the fabric, we've secured the fabric, we've locked down our out-of-band access, we've locked down our iOS access in our switches. Now it's all about identity. What are some of the things to watch out from an identity perspective?
Well, so Dave, what this really comes down to is take the time and make the efforts to identify what you need, not what you might need, but what you know you need, and restrict everything else. And then add it back in if it causes you to lose something or whatever. Having that least privilege, that zero trust mentality is more important than ever. And I can't emphasize enough that you're either going to have that and it's going to help you prevent something, or if something happens, you're going to have to answer to why you didn't have it. And everybody forgets the benefits of convenience when they've been violated, right? When a security incident happens. So take the time to refine things. Understand a great example, Dave, is Active Directory or your intrusion protection systems. You and I have had conversations on this recently. So obviously your systems have to be able to talk to Active Directory to be able to authenticate and get their Kerberos tickets and all that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that you leave your client able to contact that Active Directory server on every single port. Active Directory doesn't need port 25. That's SMTP. So, when you can define, hey, these are the exact ports that Active Directory needs, and then restrict things down at the system and the network level, create as many levels as you can. I call them the cascading fences. If you ever look at prisons, they always have cascading fences. They have an outer perimeter fence, and then a middle perimeter sometimes, and then an inner perimeter fence, so that an attacker that figures out how to get through one fence is stopped at the second and has to figure out how to get through it. You're doing the same kind of thing with these level permissions. So, take advantage of having that cascading protections, whether it be through multi-factor authentication on your accounts, or whether it be through refined conditional access policies that state what gets access to what and when, and a what could be a who or a thing. The last thought I'm going to mention on this is that you really must measure to be able to manage. And so take advantage of the reports provided by things like privileged identity management and, different systems that can tell you these are the level of logins, the amount of logins we see in a normal day, and from these type of accounts and that sort of thing. Because just like financial institutions watch for unusual behavior on accounts, you can watch for that in your user accounts, in your system accounts. If all of a sudden a user account that, always logs in on Monday through Friday, has never logged in on a Sunday, and always logs in from Ohio, now you're seeing an event where it tried to log in 150 times from Brazil on a Sunday afternoon. You want to identify those trends, and hopefully you have automated systems that pick that up and alert you, and you configure those things. But if not, you want single panes of glass and management opportunities to be able to identify that stuff quickly and react.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And just one closing point here is that I often get asked the question by organizations, especially operations teams. They're like, listen, we've operationalized our on-prem and our hybrid infrastructure. We do a really good job. We've been doing it for years. But now cloud is here, and we need to figure out how to operationalize cloud and secure the tenant. Just understand that you're not alone. In the case of Microsoft, they built what are called Azure blueprints, and they're kind of it's a blueprint of security. So, for example, if you're in the federal space, I'm from Canada, and so they actually have a Canadian federal blueprint where if you implemented this, it's meeting all the standards that are required. If you've got ISO requirements, if you've got, in the old days, SOX requirements and things like that. They've got all those blueprints in there for you to harden your tenant. Obviously, you want to test that in a not production tenant right out of the gate, because you might lock some things down. But if you're starting with a fresh tenant and you're greenfielding this is back to start secure. So start that way and work your way through it. And so really great advice there, John. Thank you very much. All right. So in the previous session, Ian was talking about zero trust, and this one is just so important. And we don't need to beat this to death, because Ian was talking about this in the last session. But for me, zero trust, if you don't understand or you think this is too complex to put in, I've worked with a lot of organizations around the world, and it really is as simple as this. By default, in a Microsoft Active Directory world, when you join a workstation or a server as a member server to Active Directory, the domain admins group is automatically added as a local administrator on every one of those devices. Boy, oh boy, John, back in the day, wasn't it easy to manage with domain admins everywhere? And so, as it turns out, the ability to laterally move through the infrastructure by taking and gaining access was actually quite easy. And so, simply put, a domain administrator, the domain admin's accounts only need to be used on domain controllers. You create a separate set of admin accounts for server admins. You create a separate set of accounts for workstation admins. Hopefully, if they're Windows workstations, Windows 10 or 11, you implement the Microsoft LAP solution where you have different admin passwords on every single workstation, and then you can just access the passwords. And then the last one is cloud admins and privileged administration. So privileged identity management for anything right now, not just on-prem, but also in the cloud, is so important. Having the ability to not only segment those accounts, but also having the ability to limit access to a specific period of time, and having an audit and approval chain in there is so important. And then the last one is, and this one's so important, John, is privileged access workstations. And I'm going to tell you right now, if anybody is listening to this session right now, and you're an IT pro, and you're on the corporate network right now, and your daily driver workstation has admin rights on your workstation, stop doing that. I know it's easier for you, but even us in IT, we need to operate as low privileged accounts, and we need to elevate in the same way that our users do. We have to basically, whatever we're taking and preaching to our end users, we need to practice the same thing in-house. All right, so John, I'm going to move on to the next one here. And this one here is securing our backups. The bad guys are out there, John. They want to take and make sure that we're going to pay. So let's take that hybrid infrastructure that we now had set up in a fabric, that we now secured. We've got Center for Internet Security baselines inside of there, and we've locked everything down. Our vulnerability assessments through our tools are showing really good. We're passing all of our cyber audits. Man, we're doing really good today, right? But then the thing happens that you weren't really expecting, which was you locked everything down, but now, John, you have a rogue administrator. You have an administrator that has access to those environments, and for whatever reason, they were disgruntled. There was actually just a case where an administrator purposely destroyed a bunch of data, ended up getting jail time for that because they destroyed the organization. And so this is where securing your backups becomes so important, as well as segmenting the duties. You don't want your day-to-day administrator and operation staff being also your backup team if possible. And so my biggest piece of advice here is that we've talked about for years with different backup companies, the 3-2-1 rule. 3-2-1 being 3 copies of your data on 2 different storage medias and 1 of those copies off-site. And now you should have 1 of those copies also as the 0, dark and immutable somewhere on some type of appliance. And the last one here is you should have 1 of those completely offline. Think of going back to tape backup days, John, where we could always go back to tape. And so you still need to protect yourself from threats within, because those threats still exist inside of your infrastructure. No matter how secured you are, if somebody has admin rights, there's always risk. Now, DR. This one here is yours, John. So securing your DR environments. We've talked about for a while having multiple DR plans now because of cyber threats. What are some of the ones that you can think of here for? What are some of the ones that you can think of here for your BCP testing for 2022 and DR in general? Thoughts of the cyber world and DR?
Well, so thanks, Dave. One of the things that I try and work with folks on is the difference between a DR plan and a BCP plan. And the way that I discuss this is that the disaster recovery plan are the actions that the IT team takes to restore systems functionality after a disaster, whether that disaster be natural, such as fire, flood, or whether that be cybersecurity-based, ransomware or a cyber attack, that sort of thing. It doesn't matter. IT is taking actions because a disaster has been declared. Now, it takes IT time to complete those operations, right? This is where your RPO and your RTO come in and that sort of thing. Well, most organizations lose significantly if they just stop doing everything while IT does their DR work. Say that you're an organization with 1,000 workers who are handling calls in a call center, and you've been totally encrypted, and your phone system isn't working, and those sorts of things. Well, now you've got 1,000 workers, and the company is either paying those 1,000 workers their hourly rate, but not getting any benefit of customer income coming in, so no revenue coming in, or the customer or the impacted entity temporarily furloughs, lays those 1,000 employees off, send them home, and now those employees aren't earning the money that they need to be able to pay their bills and send their kids to band camp or any of that kind of stuff. And so that's a negative consequence. So business continuity plan comes into play here, Dave, where it says this is what the business is going to do while IT is working on restoring the systems. This is what the business is going to do to continue or provide a continuity of service. And maybe that's flipping to an old school hardline PBX that you just have a couple lines on but allows you to take some emergency calls. Maybe it's routing it to another call center by implementing changes with your phone company, whatever it may be, but it's the business continuity that your group takes. And one of the biggest mistakes I see is IT is tasked with creating business continuity plans. Well, these aren't actions that IT are taking, and IT aren't in the best position of understanding what's necessary in a given department, let alone a given company, to keep the doors on and lights on and customers happy kind of thing. So IT can be part of the discussion. It should be part of the discussion, but these have to be created with the business unit, right? If the business unit is shipping and receiving, and IT says, this is what you need to do in shipping and receiving while we recover your systems, well, we're not shipping and receiving experts. So how can we do that? You've got to engage those business units. You have to clearly understand what they need to do to make their customers happy and keep revenue coming in, and then have a dialogue on what options exist to provide that continuity. And I will state that a lot of people are like, well, they just can't do their job without IT systems. And that may be true, but then you need to communicate that what that means if you're those 1,000 employees is you get sent home without pay while we're doing the DR work. And Dave, you and I know we've been involved in some restorations that take a long time. I mean, this brings to thought to my mind the story of I believe it was Lincoln University, a university that was founded in 1865, and it went out of business this year because of a ransomware attack occurred in December. They didn't recover the systems until March. Losses were so significant that they laid off all employees with less than a month's notice, and they terminated all scholarships, sent those students home. If they were a foreign student here on an academic visa, that was put at risk. And it's going to have implications going downstream because say you're one of those students and you're trying to get in a new college and you want credit for the 3 years work you did. Well, there's no access to those transcripts. The university is gone. There are no employees there to send copies and things. So, business continuity planning is critical.
Awesome, John. And I've got one more for us to wrap up on, because this is in your concept that we've so often spoken about, the OODA loop, and just like how you should treat security out there today. And I think in 2022, I think there needs to be some adjustments to even the way that, we've been talking about security over the years, because typically, you would identify, investigate, you'd go through a particular kind of process. And I really do believe that this needs to change, because the threats are so high risk that are out there that if an alert comes in, I know we're working with a lot of our organizations right now and saying, listen, if that alert comes in, immediately shut down whatever's coming in at risk, notify the end user of kind of what's going on, and then proceed on with the investigation. Because those few seconds that you're gaining and shutting that down ahead of time could actually be the difference between a full-on ransomware outbreak and, you being able to remediate and isolate and fence that off. So I'll give you that for a quick 60-second wrap-up here, John, and then we will hand it back.
So Dave, my thoughts on this, and I've implemented this time and again at organizations and communicated it with C-level executives that, hey, the way that I'm going to help protect your organization from catastrophic loss is taking an approach of acting as quickly as possible to contain a threat. So it's exactly as you have it here. When an alert comes in, I isolate and shut down, then I investigate. And that's anathema to many IT pros who are like, oh, it's the CEO's account, I can't isolate it without calling him and finding out. Nope. I let them know, of course, well in advance that this is going to be the approach, and they appreciate it. And I've had that exact scenario where I've isolated a CEO's account from access, and then investigated. And in that case, it happened to be a true possible compromise. But even if it wasn't, I would have acted the same way. And the CEO was very appreciative, because it inconvenienced him personally for a few hours, but it possibly prevented hundreds of employees being inconvenienced or the network being lost. So shut down, act definitively and quickly, then do your investigation and that sort of thing. So back to you, Dave.
Awesome. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to our esteemed colleague, David Rammel. We did take some questions throughout the session, so thank you everybody for being so interactive. And I don't see anything else for questions in the panel right now. So David, I'll hand it back over to you.